Thank you all very much for coming. We're going to have a day together doing this process that I developed, which came to me, interestingly, after the death of my teacher, Colette Muscat, who died in November of '03. And in December of '03, I had a sudden insight. I feel that there was a message that came to me through the ether because a sudden insight was revealed to me about how we can utilize our day in a way to use it as a teacher and to allow yourself to be able to process what goes on during your day, which of course can be full of challenges, and how to do that in very, very short period of time. My teacher was a stickler, really, for the moment. She's what I called a momentalist. Everything was in the moment, and time for her had to be reversed and brought to a standstill so that we could be lifted out of the time-space dimensional reality and into another zone, if you will, to another pan-dimensional state. So everything had to be done quickly. Part of what we're going to do with our process is to have a number of imagery exercises that will be included here on this program, which take just a few seconds. She felt that imagery actually should not take more than 2 seconds in terms of a process that you do for yourself. So she wanted to have it as homeopathic as possible. As you know, homeopathy is a micro input to get a macro response. So it's to give a quick shock to the system so as to create a movement inwardly. And a movement for her means life. So life is movement, and the cessation of movement is death. So we are in the process of constantly using a new form of movement in life other than the habitual one that you're used to. And we use the habitual life processes to stimulate you to invoke this process. And as you'll see from what we do today and our being together, how quickly this all takes place. So it is within a matter of seconds. And this is what came to me to put together everything that I had as a culmination to this point of everything that I had learned since my starting out in this direction of healthcare and a complete change in my life direction starting in 1974 when I met her in Jerusalem, changed the course and direction of my life. So it's been a 33-year process to this point of bringing into the forefront this kind of work that allows us to bring spirit into everyday life. Of course, we're using the functions of spirit and the principles of the Western tradition to apply it to your everyday life situation. So we're bringing the everyday life into spirit, and if you want, we're spiritualizing the everyday reality that we encounter. So what occurred to me at the time I had this epiphany was that we would call this process the Phoenix process. And the Phoenix process, then for me, what came through was a program that occurred to me called, which my friend Scott Osmond aptly named, the 1-minute life repair, the 1-minute life repair system, which I think was a very fine name to a system that I'm going to share with you, which takes about a minute to teach you to do, but only takes a few seconds each day to do. What also came out of this, as I evolved it, has been something called the disemergency state that comes out of the work of Dr. Robert Gibson and has been a great inspiration to me and to those who have learned this from me and have used it in their everyday life. And we're going to talk about some of the responses that people have had to the disemergency state, and which have been quite profound. And then there's the yes or no phenomenon. The yes or no phenomenon, which is such an ancient tradition, as all of these actually are. What I've done is really take processes that have been with us for thousands of years and adapt them for this contemporary time that we live, and to bring our relationship to spirit directly into this life and to make the invisible reality imminent on this earth, and to kind of change our relationship to life, and in the process other people and other issues around us may begin to change as well as we begin to shift our vibration, our energies, and so on, which this brings about. So the yes or no phenomenon will also be taken up, and I find what I discovered from it is that I think it's the genesis of all difficulties. I think it's the genesis of all of the physical and emotional and social disturbances that we encounter in life. So they're all quite profound to me, so they all come together under the rubric of Phoenix. And why Phoenix? Because what has occupied me in recent times has been the question of death. and about what happens after the cessation of movement here in this time-space reality, whether we do have to cease living in this time-space reality, whether we are able to extend our lives for an infinite period of time. So I've been occupied with this essential question since it forms the basis of the Western spiritual tradition. It's at the center point of the tradition. The center point of the tradition involves two processes or two functions, resurrection and immortality. Resurrection is a process that has occupied primarily the Western spiritual tradition through monotheism, through Judaism and Christianity as the two major strands, who are directly involved with the question of the return to life of the dead, resurrection, which is the central event that has empowered Christianity and has given it its force and power for the last 2,000 years. It has occupied the Israelite Hebraic strand prior to that and has been a center of interest from the very beginning and inception of the monotheistic tradition. The corollary source of this resurrective function has been the Egyptian pharaonic tradition. The Egyptian pharaonic tradition has seen that as a major function because, you know, the Egyptian tradition through the pharaohs was preoccupied with death and the afterlife and what happens to us after death and the mummification of the bodies and so on, and burying the pharaohs with their families and with their objects so that they would be there. When they woke up in the next reality, they would have their Cheerios, you know, and their Frosted Flakes, and everything would be ready on the table. And so the major legend that formed the pharaonic tradition was that of Osiris and Isis. Osiris, the god of the netherworld, who is a revered god, and Isis, who is the goddess of wisdom. And the goddess of wisdom has a striking role to play in the Western spiritual tradition. And what she does as her function in the Egyptian legend is to create the resurrective possibility. It happens that her husband, Osiris, is murdered by his brother Seth, who is jealous of his position and how he's revered. So this Cain and Abel type of story, which takes place in the Egyptian world, is such that Seth murders Osiris, and in doing so cuts him up into 14 pieces and buries each of these pieces in different parts of Egypt. And consequently, Isis finds out about this, that he's been murdered, because she's waiting at home for him, and she has the tahina and the hummus waiting for him and the fool madamis, you know, and he doesn't show up, you know, his hubby, and she finds out that he's been murdered. And so she goes around Egypt collecting the pieces, the severed pieces, and she brings him together. She puts the pieces together. And what she does in putting these pieces together is that she remembers him. She remembers him. And as you all are aware, members are arms and legs, and so these are the members of the body. She puts him back together, she remembers him. And she does this both physically and does a cosmic microplastic reconstruction of him, puts him back together, and also remembers him mentally through an image. So to remember is to bring oneself back into wholeness, into order, into greater complexity. So she brings them together, and when she does so, he comes back to life. And as you may be aware, everything that's talked about in the spiritual tradition has a concrete reality. It's not spoken of as metaphor. So she brings him back to life. She creates a resurrective possibility for him to be restored to a living, functioning being. It's not the first time that she did this with him, because he was murdered once before by his brother Seth, who I think was the earliest soprano that we know. So he murdered him and put him in a coffin and floated him down the Nile into the Mediterranean, and he ends up on the shores of Lebanon. And Isis turns herself into a swallow when she finds out that he's been murdered and has been floated out of Egypt, and she turns into a bird, and in doing so she flies along the Mediterranean and she finds the casket, and she lands on the shore of Lebanon and turns into Isis, opens the casket, and she kisses Osiris, and when she kisses him, he comes back to life. Consequently, this is a resurrective experience because he's brought back to life from the dead. And right there, a cedar grows. The very famous cedars of Lebanon are emblematic of that experience where Isis and Osiris got together to create the resurrective possibility. So it's all through the tradition. The Israelites had their own version of it. So there are resurrective experiences that are spoken of in the ancient Israelite tradition, about 6 or 8 experiences where people are brought back to life from the dead. Prophet Elisha brings a child back to life by lying on his body, hands to hands, feet to feet, and breathing into his nostrils, and the child is brought back to life from the dead. There are a number of experiences like this, and so it forms a basis of the Western interest from the spiritual point of view. The immortality part of it comes from the Greek tradition primarily, where they were interested in the immortality of the soul. So the Greek pre-Socratic philosophy and Plato were very interested in the immortality possibility of the soul, that it would go on in an endless way, even though there would be cessation of the physical body. So that immortality was seen as soul and spirit, and not conceived of by them as the body itself, also remaining endlessly alive. The new possibility that I'm offering is to create a possibility for resurrection and immortality where we become a unity out of a trinity. The trinity is body, soul, and spirit. The three synthesized itself, coming together into a unity of oneness, and where body, soul, and spirit become one cohesive unit. One cohesive unit. So there is now a lot of talk afoot in biology. Aubrey de Grey, who is a biologist who is quite controversial within biological circles, who is now positing that people should be living 1,000 years or more, and there's no reason why that's not the case. And he's been written up, I think there's an article on him recently in Time magazine or Newsweek about his work from a biological point of view. And he's had some critics, of course, and he's had some followers, that people who have been interested in the biological circles about this great possibility of extending life and living X number of years. And as I wrote about in my book, Healing into Immortality, which came out in 1994, I had mentioned that there were 3 scientists who got together on a national hookup on CNN and talked about the fact that we should be living 300 to 400,000 years, and that the keys to that are available, and that it's a process that's available to us but can't be invoked because there's not a social system to contain people living so long. So, you could have your mother with you for, 300,000 years. Think about that. And paying income tax, if you should so choose.